Hi, Mark Jones here with another edition of Crime Chronicles, this time coming to you from London, England, more specifically the Whitechapel district, where we go back to the 1880s and take a look at the murders of Jack the Ripper. We're talking about a string of murders that occurred primarily in London's Whitechapel district in the city's East End between August and November of 1888. Since the identity of Jack the Ripper is not known, it is also not known how many more people he may have killed before or after London's Whitechapel murders. Well, I'm coming to you now from London's East End, which, although thriving now, perhaps best known for having some of the world's best Indian restaurants on one street, back in the 1880s, it was the poorest section of London and one of the most neglected. It was ripe pickings for a serial killer like Jack the Ripper. Not only is the East End of London different today than it was back in the 1880s in terms of the population demographics, and is much more affluent than it was at that time, but also you have to picture that the East End of London, like most cities at the time, was very poorly lit. To understand the Jack the Ripper murders, a few factors should be pointed out. This was the Victorian era. Queen Victoria presided over England and the British Empire from 1837 to 1901, the longest-serving monarch in British history before the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. The Victorian era might best be summed up in the opening line of Charles Dickens' novel A Tale of Two Cities, when he said it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. While Dickens was writing about France, the same may be said about London during the Victorian era. The period saw significant scientific and technological development, plus advancements in industry and engineering, but not in art and education. Victorian society placed a premium on personal conduct. Even today, when someone is considered prudish and conservative in their moral beliefs, they are accused of possessing a Victorian morality. The emphasis on morality in the Victorian era generated social reform, but also placed restrictions on certain groups' liberty, especially with anything remotely related to sexual behavior. Prosperity rose during the Victorian era, but debilitating undernutrition and poverty persisted. Literacy and childhood education became near universal in Great Britain for the first time, at least for native Brits. While some attempts were made to improve living conditions, slum housing and disease remained a severe problem, especially for London's immigrant population. London's population swelled with immigrants during the Victorian era, many of whom, about 300,000, came from Ireland to escape the poverty brought on by the potato famine of the mid-1850s. Another group of people who flocked to London in the 1880s, which is relevant to the Jack the Ripper story, were Jews from Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire. Pogroms, or violent riots aimed at massacring or expelling an ethnic or religious group, hit Jewish populations in the Russian Empire, which included parts of modern Poland, especially hard. London's slums, especially in the East End and the Whitechapel district, teemed with Jewish immigrants from Poland, most of whom were poor. Like most other immigrant groups in London, Polish and Russian Jews endured overt ethnic discrimination and were treated as third-class citizens. Hatred toward Jews had been a part of English history for over 1,000 years, and that hatred was thriving in London in the 1880s. Around 90% of London's Jewish population lived in the poverty-stricken squalor of the Whitechapel district. The Whitechapel district in London's East End was a very unpleasant place in the 1880s. Only those with no other options or nowhere else to go would live there. Poverty and crime were rife, as was prejudice against the inhabitants there, especially toward foreigners. Prostitution or sex work was common in the Whitechapel district. There were over 60 brothels in the East End and over 200 common lodging houses or homeless shelters where people would sleep in cramped, unhealthy conditions and pay for 1 or 2 nights' stay. Women were especially ripe for exploitation, and many of the women in the Whitechapel district were down-and-out alcoholics who had to prostitute themselves sometimes just to have a bed for the night. But recent writings rebut the idea that the women were career sex workers. Some had once lived successful lives but were forced into sex work by life circumstances. One of the things that makes the Jack the Ripper case stand out so much, it was the first serial killer who was covered by the popular press at the time in such detail and in such lurid detail. Given the sexually repressed and strictly conservative culture of the Victorian era, murders so sexually savage like the Ripper murders, which were described so graphically and with every salacious detail in enormously popular penny presses of the day, that is, cheap newspapers affordable to almost everyone, titillated Londoners. In fact, if one looks at the history of serial murders, many murderers have claimed more victims over a much longer period. But one reason the Jack the Ripper case is so famous is that it was the first serial murder case covered in painstaking detail in the news media in a large city. The Jack the Ripper saga begins August 31st, 1888, with the discovery of the body of a woman named Mary Ann Nichols. Some believe that the first victim of Jack the Ripper was Martha Tabram, but the modus operandi used in Tabram's murder was so dissimilar from the subsequent Ripper murders that the historical consensus has been that Tabram was killed by someone else. The subsequent victims were first attacked from the back. Tabram was attacked from the front. Thus, Tabram has not been labeled as one of the canonical five whose deaths were attributed to Jack the Ripper. However, in a 2019 documentary by the BBC called Jack the Ripper Case Reopened, criminologist David Wilson emphatically states that Tabram was the first Ripper victim and that the Ripper merely changed his modus operandi. On August 31st, around 3:40 a.m., a man walking on Bucks Row in Whitechapel saw a canvas, but upon closer examination he noticed it was the body of a bloodied woman. It turned out to be Mary Ann or Polly Nichols. At the mortuary it was discovered that Polly Nichols had been strangled and then had her throat cut ear to ear. In what would become his most gruesome signature, her abdomen had been ripped open and mutilated. Upon questioning by Scotland Yard detectives, it was learned that Polly Nichols, who sometimes engaged in prostitution, had been seen drinking heavily in the Whitechapel area the night of her murder, and that she had been turned away from a lodging house for lack of funds. Since the victims lived on London's east side, the poorer side of the city, many accused the government, law enforcement at the time, of neglect, seeing as how the women were of such low social status, and some of whom probably engaged in prostitution just to be able to put their head down on a bed at night of some sort. The similarities between the Tabram and Nichols killings brought the murders of sex workers in Whitechapel onto the headlines. While Londoners soaked up every detail, opinions on the importance of the murders varied. Some Londoners despised the lower classes of the East End and enjoyed reading about the murders as a source of entertainment in an era that predated radio and television, while others pointed the finger for the miserable lot of East Enders at a government that cared little for its poor citizens. Jack the Ripper's second victim was Annie Chapman. On September 8th, around 6 a.m., a Whitechapel resident named Davis was leaving for work. While walking on Hanbury Street, he saw a woman's body in a courtyard or alleyway. Thinking the woman might be alive, Davis went to render aid, only to find that she had almost been decapitated. Her intestines had been ripped out and spread on her body. It was the body of Annie Chapman. The closest residence was a lodging house that was home to about 17 people, sometimes including sex workers and their clients. Annie Chapman may have been killed on the spot, or she may have been murdered somewhere else and her body brought to the area where her body was found. Mr. Davis ran to notify police, but before police arrived at the murder scene, a crowd had gathered and nearby residents were charging passers-by a penny each to view Chapman's mutilated body. Scotland Yard Inspector Frederick Aberline had no doubt that one man was responsible for both the Chapman and Nichols murders. The man who ran the lodging house remembered Chapman. She had tried to get a room in his house but was turned away because she did not have enough money. The man said she was in poor health, was known as a heavy drinker who occasionally engaged in prostitution, and that she had been seen at the nearby 10 Bells pub with a man believed to be over 40 wearing a dark coat and hat and described as looking quote-unquote foreign, a euphemism at the time for someone thought to be Jewish and from Eastern Europe or Russia. It's not known exactly what type of weapon Jack the Ripper used against his victims, a knife or some other sharp object. It was speculated by some early on that given the quote-unquote precision in which the women were murdered, that Jack the Ripper may have been a butcher or a doctor. Now, this area was replete with butchers, but very few doctors. However, subsequent investigations revealed that was not the case. There was no rhyme or reason to the way he mutilated his victims. A wet leather apron was found by Annie Chapman's body, and 2 rings had been torn from her fingers. It was clear that the apron did not belong to Annie Chapman. Suspicion centered on John Pizer, a Polish-Jewish boot fixer who regularly wore a leather apron and was known to abuse prostitutes. Thanks to the avalanche of media coverage, police felt pressure to solve the case, and Pizer was viciously attacked by the London penny press. Police detained Pizer but determined that the leather apron found beside Chapman did not belong to him. Pizer was released and, according to some sources, was compensated by the newspapers that had smeared him. As you might guess, the media of that time had a field day reporting on the Jack the Ripper murders. By now, London was abuzz with news of the Whitechapel murders, and the press was having a field day. Papers were selling better than ever before. This made Scotland Yard's job more difficult, as it was being flooded with letters and tips as to the murderer's identity, some of which were sent with good intentions, and some of which were cruel hoaxes. Who gave Jack the Ripper his nickname? Did Jack the Ripper give himself that nickname, or was it a name given to him by people in the media? Or by someone else pretending to be Jack the Ripper? On September 27, 1888, London's Central News Agency received a letter written in blood-red ink addressed to the boss. It contained several explicit threats to commit more murders and was signed Jack the Ripper. The letter was released to the public on October 1st. Likely, the letter was not written by the killer, but was instead one of many hoax letters sent to journalists and to the London Metro Police. Some suspect that it was written by a journalist to drum up more newspaper sales, but it made Jack the Ripper a household name. It triggered even more hoaxes, bogging police officers down in reading the letters and hunting down non-existent leads. The Central News Agency received a similar letter on October 6th, but agreed not to make it public. Jack the Ripper's third victim was a woman named Elizabeth Stride, the only woman not originally from England. She was a Swedish immigrant. On September 30th, around 1 a.m., a street salesman on the way home from work was riding his horse on Whitechapel's Burner Street. As he was riding through an alleyway, his horse stopped and refused to go forward. The man saw a woman slumped against the wall. He dismounted and tried to lift her, but noticed that her throat was cut. She was still bleeding, which indicated that the killer was probably near the scene. But whoever the killer was, he had escaped into the night. Even though it was late at night, Burner Street quickly filled up with sightseers, which probably allowed the killer to slip through the crowd to make his escape. Elizabeth Stride had pleasant features, was about 45 years old, and looked like a woman who had been attractive when she was younger. According to those who knew her, Elizabeth Stride had immigrated to England from Sweden and was married to a man named John Stride, who passed away in 1884. Like the other Ripper victims, Stride was described as a woman who sometimes engaged in prostitution just to keep a roof over her head. She was a heavy drinker and had been prosecuted several times for drunkenness. But unlike the other Ripper victims, she was intelligent, educated, and was fluent in 3 languages: English, Yiddish, and her native Swedish. Witnesses reported seeing Stride with a man that night and described what he was wearing. It is possible, indeed likely, that the killer was interrupted by the salesman, which disallowed him from disemboweling Stride like he had done with the other victims. Frustrated by his inability to carry out his sadistic plan, the Ripper sought out another victim that same night. Jack the Ripper's third and fourth victims were killed within 2 hours of each other, leading them to be called the double event. Victim number 4, Catherine Eddowes. Jack the Ripper's bloodlust was growing increasingly difficult to satiate, and with the murder of Catherine Eddowes, the savagery of his killings only increased. On September 30th, 1888, around 1:45 a.m. at Mitre Square, a man named Watkins discovered the body of Catherine, or Kate Eddowes. Her face was horribly mutilated, even more than the previous Ripper victims, so much that police had a difficult time identifying her. Several of her internal organs, her womb, her bladder, and her kidneys, had been removed and were missing, but the cause of her death was her throat being cut, the same as the previous 3 victims. Mercifully, death was probably quick. Most of the savagery was inflicted post-mortem. Kate Eddowes had told police that she thought she knew who the Ripper murderer was, but other people, especially Whitechapel sex workers, had made similar claims. She had returned to London from Kent to claim her reward for naming the Ripper. On September 29th, she and her common-law husband pawned his boots to buy breakfast. Apparently, she found more money that day because that same night she was taken to Bishopsgate Police Station, so drunk she could not tell police her name. She was released just after midnight on the 30th and would be murdered less than 1 hour later. She was seen about 1:30 a.m. talking to a man, likely her killer. This would suggest that she was either mistaken or lying when she told police she knew who Jack the Ripper was. Some alleged that the way her organs were removed were indicative of a killer that had at least a rudimentary knowledge of anatomy, which fueled rumors that the murderer might be a butcher, a doctor, or a medical student. But subsequent analysis indicated this was not the case, and that the mutilation had not been very skillful after all. But this time the killer left a clue. A portion of her apron was missing and soon discovered, letting police know the route the killer took, but a search was futile. But the most significant find was a message written in chalk above a nearby doorway, which read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Was this message written by the murderer who was Jewish? Or was it written by the murderer who was not Jewish, but was trying to make police believe falsely that the killer was Jewish? Or was it written by someone else who simply hated Jews? Scotland Yard boss Sir Charles Warren ordered that the chalk writing be erased, thinking it irrelevant and fearing it would lead to riots against the Jewish community in Whitechapel. He was condemned by both the press and the City of London police for destroying evidence, especially on a case outside his official jurisdiction. In November, he was forced to resign. So, what did I mean by Warren being out of his jurisdiction? The Eddowes murder presented another twist and complication, one probably not considered by Jack the Ripper. To understand, one must know the political boundaries in London. Most of what we call London today is typically referred to as Greater London or Metropolitan London, and falls within the jurisdiction of the London Metro Police or Scotland Yard. But an entirely different political jurisdiction within London is the City of London, a 1 square mile area that closely approximates the original city of London founded by the Romans in 47 AD. The City of London boundaries are identified by the City of London markers, with the corresponding coat of arms on a shield held by a dragon. Primarily known now as the business and finance center of London, the City of London has its own mayor, who does not get paid a salary, and its own police force, separate from the London Metro Police. An interesting side note, the British royal family is officially banned from appearing in the City of London. The location of the murder meant that 2 police departments were involved in the hunt for Jack the Ripper, and the 2 agencies did not cooperate or share information effectively. The panic continued to spread. In a rare case of inserting herself into police business, Queen Victoria advocated better street lighting and more police officers on patrol in the Whitechapel district. Another letter was supposedly sent by Jack the Ripper, this time to a man named George Lusk. Lusk chaired the Mile End Vigilance Committee, a group of volunteers trying to assist in catching Jack the Ripper. The letter was addressed "From Hell." The parcel also contained a human kidney, which the writer claimed belonged to Kate Eddowes. The kidney was human, but there was no way to prove it belonged to Kate Eddowes. Such was the lack of technology at the time. The investigation continued throughout October, with no luck, but no murders that month either.
And finally, victim number 5, Mary Kelly.
The savagery of the Ripper killings would only get worse. On November 9, 1888, a rent collector banged on the Dorset Street door of a Whitechapel prostitute or sex worker named Mary Kelly. Getting no answer and thinking Kelly might be trying to avoid her rental obligations, he looked through the window to see the body of Mary Kelly on her bed. Her face was so mutilated that she was unrecognizable. Kelly was younger than the other victims, only 25. She was a hard-drinking sex worker, but not as destitute as the previous victims. She claimed to have come from Ireland and was known to get into street brawls with other prostitutes and was sometimes called Black Mary. The problem she had with her common-law husband, Mr. Barnett, led some to believe that she was the victim of domestic violence, not Jack the Ripper. But the modus operandi of the murder was so like the other victims that police concluded that she was killed by the Ripper and not Barnett. Kelly was the only victim killed inside her home. Although other prostitutes or sex workers in Whitechapel residents continued to be killed, it is believed that Mary Kelly was the last Jack the Ripper victim. Over 100 people have been identified as suspects over the past 140 years. The mystery of Jack the Ripper's identity contributes to the fascination with the case, and is why there will always be a cottage industry of books and documentaries about the Ripper murders. Who are some of the suspects in the Ripper murders? Montague John Druitt was a lawyer and school teacher who committed suicide by drowning in 1888. He was said to be, quote, sexually insane, and was allegedly suspected of being the Ripper by members of his family. His death shortly after the last canonical murder led Assistant Chief Constable Sir Melvin McNaughton to name him as a suspect. On September 1st, the day after the first canonical murder, Druitt was in Dorset playing cricket, and most experts now believe that the killer was local to Whitechapel, whereas Druitt lived miles away on the other side of the River Thames in Kent. Inspector Frederick Aberline appeared to dismiss Druitt as a serious suspect on the basis that the only evidence against him was the coincidental timing of his suicide shortly after the last canonical murder. Jacob Eisenschmidt was a Swiss butcher living in the Milford Road area. He suffered from severe depression and psychiatric disorders and had a history of violent attacks on women in the Whitechapel area. On September 11, 1888, 2 doctors reported to the police that they suspected Eisenschmidt of being the Ripper due to his strange habits. Eisenschmidt's wife told police that he was violent and erratic, that he always carried large knives even when they were not required for his trade, that he had threatened to kill her on at least one occasion, and that he had left home for no reason 2 months ago and only returned sporadically. Eisenschmidt was arrested on 13 September, and a psychiatric evaluation found he was violently insane and potentially dangerous, with a judge ordering him imprisoned in a mental hospital. However, the double event murder of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes occurred on 30 September, while Eisenschmidt was in the hospital, exonerating him of the murders. Then there are the suspects that are found among the most irredeemable conspiracy theorists, men who are high profile and thus ripe for outlandish conspiracy ideas. Conspiracy theorists revel in the prospect that someone from the upper classes or someone with celebrity status committed the murders. These accusations are, to put it mildly, far-fetched. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, was first mentioned in print as a potential suspect when Philip Julian's biography of Prince Albert's father, King Edward VII, was published in 1962. The theory was brought to major public attention in 1970 when an article suggested that Prince Albert Victor had committed the murders after being driven mad by syphilis. The suggestion was widely dismissed, as Prince Albert Victor had strong alibis for the murders, and it is unlikely that he suffered from syphilis. Plus, it is clear from the evidence that whoever the Ripper was, he knew the Whitechapel area very well, something very unlikely for a person who did not live there. Sir John Williams, 1st Baronet, was obstetrician to Queen Victoria's daughter, Princess Beatrice, and was accused of the Ripper crimes in the book Uncle Jack, released in 2005 and written by one of his descendants, Tony Williams and Humphrey Price. The authors claim that the victims knew the doctor personally, that they were killed and mutilated in an attempt to research the causes of infertility, and that a badly blunted surgical knife which belonged to Williams was the murder weapon. Much of the research in the book was flawed, and Williams is not considered a serious suspect. Boston Corbett was an English-born American soldier who killed John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of Abraham Lincoln, in 1865. Corbett was known for his devout religious beliefs and eccentric behavior, and had disappeared in 1888, just a few months before the murders. Writer Dale Walker proposed Corbett as a suspect in the Ripper murders, stating that Corbett was London-born. He was certifiably insane. He escaped from a Topeka, Kansas insane asylum in June 1888. He was described as down on whores. He had killed, men to be sure, before. He was acquainted with sharp instruments in his hat fishing trade. He had motive, means, and opportunity. But the chances are that Corbett was named as a suspect simply because of his notoriety for having killed John Wilkes Booth.
There has even been speculation that Jack the Ripper fled London and continued to murder in other cities and other countries.
Most such suspicions are far-fetched or tenuous, but some are possible. William Bury had recently moved to Dundee from the east end of London when he strangled his wife Ellen Elliot, a former sex worker, on 4 February 1889. He inflicted extensive wounds to her abdomen after she was dead and packed the body into a trunk. He was arrested, tried, found guilty of murder, and hanged in Dundee. A link with the Ripper crimes was investigated by police, but Bury denied any connection, despite making a full confession to his wife's homicide. Nevertheless, the executioner, James Barry, promoted the idea that Bury was the Ripper. There was also graffiti at Bury's flat, accusing the occupant of being Jack Ripper, which was seen as a confession, and the final of the Ripper's canonical five murders occurred shortly before Bury moved away from Whitechapel. However, Ellen Elliot had been strangled to death and had only light cuts to her abdomen, whereas the victims of the Ripper had their throats cut and had much more extensive abdominal wounds. Frederick Deeming murdered his first wife and 4 children in 1891. His crimes went undiscovered, and later that year he immigrated to Australia with his second wife, whom he also murdered. He was arrested, sent to trial, and found guilty. He wrote in a book and later boasted in jail that he was Jack the Ripper, but he was either imprisoned or in South Africa at the time of the Ripper murders. The police denied any connection between Deming and the Ripper. He was hanged in Australia. According to Robert Napper, a former Scotland Yard detective, the British police did not consider him a suspect because of his 2 possible alibis, but others believe that Deeming was not in jail at the time, and there is some evidence that he was back in England. Søren Kosowski, alias George Chapman, was born in Poland but immigrated to the UK sometime between 1887 and 1888, shortly before the start of the Whitechapel murders. Between 1893 and 1894, he assumed the name of Chapman. He successfully poisoned 3 of his wives and became known as the Borough Poisoner. He was hanged for his crimes in 1903. At the time of the Ripper murders, he lived in Whitechapel, where he had been working as a barber under the name Ludwig Schlowski. By some accounts, Chapman was Inspector Frederick Aberline's favorite suspect. However, others disagree that Chapman, as he murdered his 3 wives with poison, and it is uncommon, though not unheard of, for a serial killer to make such a drastic change in modus operandi.
The Jack the Ripper case has never been solved, but there have been a number of very key suspects, including a Jewish-Polish immigrant who, in the view of most students of the Jack the Ripper murders, is the prime suspect. But again, his guilt has never been proven.
Aaron Kosminski was a Polish-Jewish immigrant who was admitted to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum in 1891. Kosminski was named as a suspect by Sir Melvin Macnaghten in 1894 and by several police officials. One writer wrote, "The only person who had ever had a good view of the murderer unhesitatingly identified the suspect the instant he was confronted with him." This suspect also apparently fit their profile, a sexual maniac of a virulent type, that he was living in the immediate vicinity of the scenes of the murders, and that if he was not living immediately alone, his people knew of his guilt and refused to give him up to justice. Kosminski lived in Whitechapel. However, he was largely harmless in the asylum. His insanity took the form of auditory hallucinations, a paranoid fear of being fed by other people, a refusal to wash or bathe, and self-abuse or masturbation. In his book, The Cases That Haunt Us, former FBI profiler John Douglas states that a paranoid individual such as Kosminski would likely have openly boasted of the murders while incarcerated, but there is no record he ever did so. Kosminski was confined to a lunatic asylum from 1891 until his death in 1919. In March 2019, the highly respected Journal of Forensic Sciences published a study that claimed DNA from Kosminski and Catherine Eddowes was found on her shawl. Other scientists cast doubt in the study, and the journal printed an expression of concern after the authors were unable to produce the original data. In the BBC documentary Jack the Ripper, The Case Reopened, hosts Emilia Fox and David Wilson employ geoprofiling, drawing connections between Kosminski's residence and the murders, concluded that Kosminski was the most likely suspect. As for the double event murders, Kosminski could have easily left the scene of the Stride murder, went to his home to change his bloody clothes, which had been seen by eyewitnesses, and made his way to the scene of the Eddowes murder, where the killer was seen in different clothes. According to some, The accusations against Kosminski may have reflected the anti-immigrant and anti-Jewish sentiment in London at the time. But since the Whitechapel area was home to so many immigrant Jews, it is reasonable to assume that one of the residents there may have been the Ripper.
Well, despite the claims of people who have written books about this topic claiming to have solved the murders, the identity of Jack the Ripper will never be known. But we do know one thing. Brick Lane, in the Whitechapel area where Jack the Ripper operated, it's now a thriving area and where one can get some fantastic Indian cuisine. Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of Crime Chronicles. As we delve into the darker side of human nature, we invite you to join us on our journey by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Your support helps make possible our inquiry into the sometimes unsettling but always fascinating phenomenon known as crime and justice. So hit that like and subscribe button right now and don't miss future episodes. Till then, Mark Jones, hoping you will join our Crime Chronicles community. And thanks for tuning in.